How do you know when you are in good therapy? There's a lot of bad therapists out there. And when we have limited time, limited resources, we want to make sure that we're putting our energy, our money into therapy that's going to be useful for us. And so in this podcast episode, I want to share, as a licensed psychotherapist myself, some ideas for what you may look for that's going to give you some indications that your therapy is going to be good, meaningful, transformative for you. And it's not, I think, what many people think it is. We're also going to talk about harmful therapy, and we're going to talk about some questions that you can ask yourself, ask your therapist, that will help you move from maybe okay or mediocre therapy to really good, meaningful therapy. So let's get into it. Hi, I'm Thaís Sky, licensed psychotherapist and your host here on Reclaim, the podcast that brings nuance to popular psychology and offers help beyond self-help. After a decade in the wellness world as a yoga teacher and a somatic coach, I became disillusioned with approaches that keep people on a self-improvement treadmill without addressing the deeper patterns that are keeping people stuck. That's what led me to go back to school for clinical psychology and to study psychoanalytic psychotherapy, because real lasting change requires more than behavioral fixes. So if you're a tender-hearted human craving substance, complexity, and a more honest look at the human experience, you're in the right place. And today we're going to talk about, are you in good therapy? I think most people assume that they would know if they're getting good therapy and that they know if they're getting bad therapy. But I'm not so sure. There are, like I said, a lot of bad therapists out there. And I want you to get the kind of therapy that's going to change your life. If you have limited time, limited money, limited energy, you've got to invest it in the right places. And so I want to give you some guidelines, some ways to think about what good therapy is that's going to be supportive for you in not only finding the right therapist for you, but if you are in therapy, making that therapy even more meaningful. Because, when therapy isn't working, it can be tempting to write the whole thing as not good. I hear a lot of people have one bad experience with a therapist and decide the therapy is stupid, that therapy doesn't work for people. And I'm here to tell you that, yes, while there are some real bad players in the field, there are also a lot of really wonderful people doing really great work out there. And just because you haven't found them yet doesn't mean they're not out there, and doesn't mean that you can't be helped. But what may be helpful is to learn how to discern sooner whether that therapy is going to be helpful or not, so that you're more likely to find what's going to be useful for you. One of the things that I didn't really know before I became a psychotherapist is that there's different ways of working. There are different therapy modalities, and you may call me stupid. How could I have not known that? But I didn't. And I think a lot of people actually don't know that when they're looking for a therapist. They don't know that there are different options. They don't know that there are different ways that therapists view psychological change. And so we're going into therapy thinking we're going to get something. We end up not getting that thing. We feel frustrated. We feel like there's something wrong with us. And we leave the therapy feeling demotivated, and that there was nothing good that's going to be able, and that we're not going to be able to get helped. But it's also tricky because good therapy doesn't always feel good. And not all therapy that feels good is actually helpful. So I want to kind of break that down a little bit and help us think about, how can we really discern if this is going to be the useful therapy that we want it to be? I think this is one of the many reasons why AI therapy is on the rise. ChatGPT is safe. And if we've been feeling failed by therapists who say they're going to help us and they don't help us, it's so understandable why we would go to a chatbot that we know there's low risk, right? Like if they get it wrong, we can just adjust, or we can just say something back and it's going to modify to eventually say what we want it to say. And so it's very understandable that many of us maybe lean on something like ChatGPT to get therapy rather than risking looking for somebody that may ultimately fail us and disappoint us. ChatGPT is free and it's easy to use. And like I said, it's very low risks. But of course, there's something that we're really missing out on when we use ChatGPT for therapy, is that we're misunderstanding what therapy is actually here to do for us. Good therapy, meaningful therapy is here to change something deep within us. ChatGPT may be able to replace CBT because if we're only talking about behavioral fixes, ChatGPT is going to have great advice for what you can change. But if we're looking to try to understand why we keep doing the thing that we say we want to change, then it may be useful for us to think about how can we get the right therapy for us. Because therapy is not just about being understood, and it's not just about being given advice, right? Good therapy happens in a relationship where there's something at stake. And while AI can certainly simulate understanding, it can't be in a relationship with you. And that difference matters because change, the types of things that we're deeply wanting to change within ourselves is often a result of relational rupture and misunderstanding. And so what is broken in relationship is really can only be truly addressed when there is something at stake, when there is the risk of it not working or not getting. A person being able to disappoint us is the only way that we're going to learn trust, right? Change happens in relationship, not just through insight or not just through someone telling you what you want to hear. So if we're going to take the risk to get into therapy, then we have to make sure that you're getting good therapy. One thing I do want to mention is that there is no universal standard for good therapy. An example that comes to mind is Good Will Hunting. Even though that's not really a classic therapist relationship, we can see how the mentor, Robin Williams, really does take on this therapist role, and that it's through his questions, it's through his curiosity, it's through that relationship that the main character, Matt Damon, heals and changes and transforms. Now, when I look at that movie, I don't think that would be defined as good therapy, but it was obviously meaningful and helpful and good for Matt Damon. So part of what's hard about this podcast episode is that there is no one definition of good therapy. There's not one thing that you can count on that you'll know for sure you're getting good therapy. Part of what makes therapy so magical is that it's going to be different for each person, and that even one person may have a totally different therapy experience with a different therapist. If you work with a female therapist and then you work with a male therapist, they may evoke different things inside of you. You may not be able to work through some of the things you want to work through with a female therapist because part of what you want to work through is your relationship with men, for example, right? And so different therapists may provide something very different for you, even if the modality that they're choosing is very similar. So it's tricky. There is no clear-cut, definition of what good therapy is. But if you were to look on the internet, if you look on social media, you'll get a clear sense that good therapy is when you feel better after a session. If you leave a session constantly feeling good, there's a seductive idea that means that the therapy is working. Another one is if we feel validated by our therapist, we feel like our therapist really gets us and is constantly supporting everything that we say and do, that feels really good. And so we may think then, oh, I'm getting good therapy. My therapist really gets me. However, one of the things that I want us to think about here together is that just because you may feel short-term relief, you may feel a little bit better after a session, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're experiencing something really transformational. I'm not saying that you can't feel good after a therapy session. I'm just saying that the experience of feeling good after a session may or may not be an indicator that you're getting good therapy. Because of course, therapy can then just become a place that we vent. Therapy can be a place that we just get reassurance. Therapy can be a place where we do a lot of talking, but nothing really changes, right? Something still remains unchanged. Talk therapy has to do something for you in order for it to make it worth your while. Let's just challenge some misconceptions that we have about what isn't good therapy, right? Like good therapy is not just advice giving. If a therapist is constantly just telling you what to do, you're probably not getting a meaningful treatment. Because let's be honest, you probably don't need another person telling you what to do. You probably have ideas of what you should be doing. The difficulty is that you're not doing it. I often talk to my supervisees or my mentees that if we are bothering to do the same thing to our clients, to say the same thing to our clients that everyone else in their lives are telling them, we're missing out on something. Because if everybody knows that Bob should sell his car, everyone's telling Bob, you need to sell your car. And then you, the therapist, are just saying the same thing. We're just playing out the exact same dynamic that Bob is experiencing in every single other relationship. Bob probably needs to explore more deeply what is getting in the way of him listening to advice that everyone is telling them. Advice is cheap. ChatGPT can give you advice without knowing much about you. So why would you want to spend your precious time, your precious money on a therapy, this precious 50 minutes that you probably have once a week, maybe 45 minutes, maybe twice a week if you're lucky? Why would you want to spend it on getting advice? Sometimes we get excited by this idea. Well, they're the authority, or they have a greater perspective that they'll be able to tell me what to do from this higher vantage point. And that may be true, and that may be sometimes useful to talk about and to work through with your therapist. But in general, if all you're getting out of therapy is advice, you're probably not doing any meaningful work internally or with your therapist. Another thing that good therapy is not, it's not constant reassurance and validation. And that's tricky because feeling supported matters, feeling seen matters, feeling like your therapist understands you matters. But therapy shouldn't organize itself, the whole experience, around telling you only what you want to hear. There's more to therapy than just reassurance. And so that could be a feature of it. But let's not mistake it for the whole thing, because reassurance in and of itself probably isn't going to transform and change you the way I think sometimes we wish it could. Good therapy is not always comfortable. You're not always going to leave therapy feeling good, feeling better. We're here to create real psychological change. We're in therapy because we want to change something about how we are experiencing our lives. And if we in therapy never feel challenged, if we never feel misunderstood, if we never feel missed, then likely something is being avoided. Things are too sweet, too on this level of nurturance and reassurance. And again, while that's useful, we want to be really, really thoughtful that that's not just the whole thing. Okay. And then the other thing that therapy is not, it's not an endless circling of some insight. Insight that doesn't shift anything can become its own defense. And so if you're finding yourself constantly arriving at the same insight and nothing is changing, there's maybe an opportunity to explore something more deeply with your therapist around why that could be. So here's what good therapy can often feel like. Okay. Now, I want to make sure that I'm not talking about this as like a checklist, but more as like tendencies. What we tend to see in good therapy is that you start to see patterns that you couldn't see before. You start to listen and feel and think different things than you've seen, felt, or thought before, right? You feel met by this therapist, but not always necessarily agreed with. You start to experience a growing capacity to talk about and explore difficult feelings. The therapist and you have a good relationship, one built on respect and built on care, one where you grow to actually really care for this therapist. And I'm not talking about care for them, like you feel responsible for them. We're going to talk a little bit later more about that. But it's more that if we want our therapy to change us, we're going to have to care deeply about the therapy. The experience of therapy is going to have to take up more of our mental space if we want what's happening in the room to infiltrate and impact and change how we are experiencing the rest of our lives. Let me give you a little bit of why that is. Again, I mentioned earlier, right, this idea that what gets broken in relationships have to be healed in relationships. So if we going into therapy, wanting to change some experience that we're having in our relationships, then the relationship with the therapist is going to become a prime place for us to work through and explore the feelings that we haven't been able to work through and explore in the relationships that hurt us or that impacted us in a way that we're still grappling with. In order for that to happen, the relationship with the therapist is going to have to matter a whole lot. Now, this can get scary for some of us because this starts to touch on this idea of dependency. There's a lot of ways in which how therapists harm their clients is through the misuse of dependency. When a therapist says, you can't heal without me, you need me in order for you to change, that's misuse of dependency. But if a therapist says, you can depend on me, you can lean more on me, we can have more sessions together, I can take up more space in your mind as someone that you can trust and you can talk to. Now we're talking about fostering a type of dependency that actually will help us work through what has been broken in the past that now we want to change for our future relationships. Does that make sense? I hope I'm being clear there. A lot of times we feel like, well, I can't depend on people. I need to be independent. I need to be on my own. I can't depend on others, right? And then we may really struggle in our intimate partnerships because intimate partnerships require being able to lean, depend, ask for help. And so where do we get to work through some of that? A therapist relationship is a great place for it because a good therapist, and we'll talk more about that later, is going to have clear boundaries so that you know that you can depend on them without it being going to a place that's inappropriate. That's the job of the therapist. You pay the therapist to hold a very strong boundary for you to then be able to bring up all that you want and need to bring up to the therapist. So when we're talking about what do we feel, how does good therapy, what does it feel like? It feels like someone that we can really lean on, that really matters to us, that it takes a weight in our minds. And that when we go into the session, that once a week or twice, however often you go in, that you're really left thinking about the session, that it's mattering to you. That's an indication that what you're going to be working through and talking about and experiencing in therapy is going to create meaningful change for you. You know that you may be in good therapy when you experience moments of discomfort, surprise, frustration, annoyance, boredom. You may feel understimulated, right? These are great signs that you are in a relationship with someone that is mattering to you, because if you don't feel annoyed by someone, that means that they're not impacting you. The fact that you're in a therapy and it's impacting you to the point where you're having the moments of feeling some dread, feeling resistance, feeling annoyance, that could be an indication that you're in good therapy, as long as it's being talked about. If you're experiencing dread but then aren't talking about it, or you're talking about it and your therapist belittles you or tell you not to feel that way, then you're probably not in good therapy. So we want to be careful here. We're allowed to have all sorts of thoughts and feelings about our therapist, and a good therapist is going to be able to help you make sense of those thoughts and feelings. A bad therapist is going to weaponize those feelings against you. And that's where some really kind of harmful manipulation can happen in the therapy relationship. Another sign that you may be in good therapy, like I said, right, is that the relationship is meaningful, but that beyond that, that things happen between you and your therapist are getting then talked about with your therapist. So that your therapy is not just about stories that's happening outside, but also a here and now exploration with each other. That is such a great indication that you are getting meaningful therapy. And I'm not talking about just getting feedback. I'm not saying you've given feedback to your therapist. I wish you were more like this, but rather being able to explore and talk about how you are experiencing your therapist as a tool, as a platform for understanding something more about yourself, right? So something starts to shift, not just in what you understand, but how you experience yourself when there is a relationship, that it becomes an experiential playground for you to wrestle and work through how you may be understanding yourself and your other relationships. An example of this is, let's say a client spends several sessions talking about how people always let me down. And so they're describing friends who cancel plans, partners who become distant, bosses who don't appreciate them, right? There's this clear sense in the person that people are disappointing. Now, let's say that in a session, a therapist needs to reschedule due to an emergency and offers the patient alternative times. The client responds with a noticeably flat, okay, no problem, but then becomes quiet in the following session. They return to talking about a recent friend who didn't show up for them. We following so far? If the therapy only stays at the level of other people let me down, well, something important is getting missed, right? Which is what is happening between the two of them. That the therapist's cancellation lands in the same emotional field as the client has been describing. But instead of staying with the immediate experience of like, I not only feel like everyone lets me down, but you let me down. Fuck you. I'm mad at you. How could you have done that, right? Instead of doing that evocative emotional work, the patient, the client, it displaces it and talks about a third party, talks about a recent event where a friend let them down. And so if you're in meaningful therapy, the therapist is listening to multiple levels of experiencing. They're listening to you talking about how let down you feel by other people, but they're also listening to the relationship and the possibility that the client is also talking about the relationship, right? And so in meaningful psychotherapy, the therapist may say, I wonder if you're feeling let down by me, right? I wonder if you're disappointed in me. I wonder if it's hard to express it directly to me. And I wonder if you feel safer to generalize it towards or talk about a friend than to risk addressing it here, right? How the therapist brings it up will be different depending on the therapist, but the general invitation is, hey, it's not just happening out there. It may now actually be happening here. And that's hard for some of us to think about it this way because we're like, no, therapy is a place that I don't experience these things. Therapy is supposed to be the place where I feel safe from these relational risks and that I can count on you. But we don't work through our fear or disappointment of people letting us down by being in a relationship where we never feel let down. We work through the feelings by experiencing a relationship where there's also an opportunity to talk about it. And so in meaningful psychotherapy, you'll say to your therapist, I feel disappointed by you that you canceled the session. And the therapist will say, tell me more. I want to hear more about that. What was it like for you? What was it like for you to say, okay, no problem, and now come in and actually have it be a problem? What was that shift like for you, right? The therapist will be very curious to know more and to bring language to this experience. And as we do, we start to potentially shift the narrative. It's not just that people always let me down, is that people disappoint. People are also willing to listen to my disappointment, and that can make such a big difference. So one of my favorite thought leaders on the internet is Jonathan Shudler, and he shares a Substack where he asks, are you getting meaningful psychotherapy? And it's a 3-question test, and it's very simple, but I appreciated it, and I'll link it in the show notes if you want to read the whole thing. But he wrote, here's a 3-question test to determine if you're getting meaningful, in-depth psychotherapy. 1, think of a time you were upset with your therapist. Did you tell them? No. You are not working in depth. Yes, you may be working in depth. 2, did your therapist respond with non-defensive curiosity and genuine interest in hearing your thoughts and feelings about them? No, you're not working in depth. Yes, you may be working in depth. If you did not tell your therapist that you were upset with them, here's a chance at redemption. He writes, number 3, is your therapy relationship on a trajectory where you will be more likely to tell them in the future? And then he goes, why these specific questions? Because we repeat relationship patterns throughout our lives. This is human nature. Our patterns can be as invisible to us as water is to fish. Meaningful psychotherapy is a relationship. Problematic relationship patterns will be repeated in the therapy relationship too. Oh no, I know. For so many of us, that sounds like a terrible, terrible thing. But it's actually a really wonderful thing. Because when you discuss, he writes, when you discuss and explore your patterns in real time as they are lived out in the therapy relationship, you start to recognize and understand them. This is how you begin to free yourself from self-defeating patterns and create new ones. What goes wrong in a therapy relationship is a window into what goes wrong in other relationships. This is the path to self-knowledge and wholeness. This is what it means to work in depth. So if you are afraid to bring up your feelings to your therapist, it's probably also afraid to bring your feelings into other relationships. That's okay. That's why I appreciate question number 3. Can you imagine, though, this relationship is moving towards a trajectory where maybe one day I will be brave enough to say it and the therapist will be receptive to it. This is where ChatGPT can't possibly replace therapy, right? And so if you're thinking, oh, my ChatGPT is giving me more than my therapist is giving me. I saw a Bustle article where someone said, my therapist gives me empty platitudes. At least ChatGPT gives me actionable advice. If that's how you're feeling, odds are you're probably not in good therapy. And then you have a couple opportunities. You can either bring that into your therapy and see if we can move it into something more meaningful by telling the therapist, I use ChatGPT and I felt it was more helpful than you because I'm tired of your empty platitudes, right? I mean, you don't have to say it with sass. You can say it with sass if you want, but you're being honest with your therapist that they're not helpful for you. And again, back to Jonathan Shedler's questions, if the therapist acts in a non-threatened way and is curious about it, that's wonderful. You just took a relational risk that's going to help you know something more about yourself. But if you're not bringing it up and you're just using ChatGPT to get what your therapist isn't getting, well, then you're wasting your money in your therapy. Why are you paying someone if you're not going to try to use the therapy in a way that's going to be helpful for you? Then, of course, it makes a lot of sense. You're just going to use ChatGPT, you know? And so, yes, ChatGPT can serve its function. It can give the advice. But if you want meaningful change, you're probably going to have to take some relational risks. And whatever you're feeling towards your therapist, the invitation is to talk about it with your therapist. And if they respond defensively, if they get shut down, and you try after a few sessions to work, to talk more about it, and they continue to either tell you that's not what's happening, tell you can't say that, shut you down in any sort of way, then that's a sign that this is not going to be good therapy for you. But if they're receptive, if they sometimes get a little defensive, but they're willing to move and work and talk more about it with you, then maybe there's some good here that you can get, right? Maybe there's something here that could be generative for you if you're willing to stick it out and continue to have these hard conversations with your therapist. Okay, so those are some indications, right, of like what good therapy feels like. It doesn't necessarily always feel good. In fact, most of the time, you're not going to feel good after good therapy because good therapy is going to force you to really confront some difficult things about yourself. That's how we create psychological change. However, I'm not again saying that you can't ever feel good after therapy. It's just maybe it's not the indicator that you are in good therapy. But they're okay. So that's how we know we may be in good therapy. What do we look for, right, when we're looking for a good therapist? Again, I want to be careful here because I don't want to reduce all this to a list. But there are certain qualities that tend to be present when the work is really meaningful. One, they're actually thinking about you, not just responding. There's a sense of intentionality behind what your therapist says. They don't just constantly react in the moment. They formulate, they hold things in mind over time. They pause. There's some space for silence where they're thinking about what you're sharing. You feel that you're being considered, not just constantly reacted to. And that can be a little tricky because sometimes we enter therapy hoping that it's going to be more of a back and forth conversation. And sometimes that's true, but sometimes it's not just going to be this ping pong. There's going to have to be some space for the therapist to really think about what you're saying. So what they're responding to is going to be thoughtful and not reactive. And I think that's why, back in the day, Freud invited people to lay on the couch. He wanted to get away from this idea of staring at each other with this expectation of I speak, you speak, and we're going to be proper. And this is social etiquette and we can't interrupt each other, right? And he moved it towards a couch where so people aren't just staring at him. And that allows him to think. And I think there's something to be said about that. We have this culture now, especially with Zoom therapy, of staring at each other and then expecting it to be this fast ping pong of a conversation. But if there's no room to think, there's a potential that something is getting reenacted. Okay, so another sign that you may be working with a good therapist is that they don't rush to reassure or to resolve tension. They can tolerate your discomfort and their own discomfort. and they don't immediately move towards soothing or fixing or giving advice, right? There's something about their ability to tolerate your grief that can be helpful for us in then processing our grief. But every time you bring up a feeling and your therapist is quick to try to reassure, tell you don't feel that way, that's not how, then it's probably a sign of their own discomfort. But it can often then feel for you like there's something unbearable about it, because if even your therapist can't tolerate it, how could you possibly tolerate it? Right. So it's actually tremendously meaningful when there can just be a space and opportunity for you to have a feeling without it being having to be moved into reassurance. Yes, or to soothing, or, so much of healing work is grief work, is grappling with the grief of what we didn't get. And artful therapy has a lot of space for that grief. There are things that we can't resolve. Life is suffering. It's hard. It's impossible sometimes. And when we move so often to just reassure or to shut down or to reframe, we're kind of denying an essence of the human experience. And then it's not actually useful for the client. A good therapist will help you see things that you couldn't see on your own. They're offering insights or ideas, interpretations that expand how you may be thinking about something. A good therapist is asking you about the relationship. They know that the relationship between the two of you really matters. How you experience your therapist really, really matters. And so you're not just talking about your life. You're talking about things that are happening in the room together. Feelings towards your therapist, misunderstandings, moments of tension. And those moments are used or explored rather than, again, just being told not to feel that way or that this will go away, right? But really metabolized together. A really good sign that you are with a good therapist is that they don't actually need to be a good therapist. They're not organized around being liked, being seen as helpful, always getting it right, which means that they can miss you, they can get it wrong, and then they can work with that rupture. They can say something that doesn't land and then stay in it with you as you experience it not landing. And so, this is a big one that I see a lot in my conversations with other therapists is this: we really want to be good and we want to be seen as helpful. And that often gets in the way of doing the right work with our clients, because we can want to be liked, but oftentimes therapy isn't about being liked. It's about stirring up really uncomfortable things. If this relationship is going to be healing for you, it's going to have to evoke uncomfortable feelings, right? And in our desire to be liked, we may avoid, dismiss, or deny, or move away from what needs to be said in order for something to get stirred up and moved in the therapeutic relationship. And of course, you know that you're in good hands when there is movement over time, even if slow. Not dramatic transformation. You're not getting your mind blown every session because, that insight stuff isn't necessarily what transforms us. But something is shifting within you in terms of how you think, in terms of how you feel, in terms of how you relate. Even if it's more awareness, more honesty, or more capacity to stay with yourself, those are indications that you're in something meaningful. You're expanding your ability to be with yourself. That's a wonderful sign that you're in good therapy. It may be frustrating, though, because we may be wanting obvious external things to be different. And that can be so frustrating for so many of us. Like, I've been in therapy for years and I'm still struggling with these things. And, we want to be thoughtful about some magical thinking or some fantasies that we thought maybe things that are very deeply rooted was going to be transformed or changed in a short amount of time. But again, these are all grist for the mill, all things for you to talk about with your therapist. So to recap, in good therapy, there will be moments where your therapist feels off. They may have an off day. They may have a bad day. You may feel frustration towards them. They may be hard to understand. They may say something that feels like a real miss. The question isn't whether or not that happens. The question is what can happen with it, what you do with it, and how the therapist then responds and makes use of it with you. So good therapy, right, isn't about finding someone who always feels good with you. This isn't a friendship. This isn't supposed to be feeling like how it feels with your best friend, where you just get advice and reassurance, everything feels good, and da da da. Right? This is a place where you're trying to create some meaningful psychological change. So it's, good therapy is about finding someone who can help you stay in contact with what's true for you, even when that's uncomfortable. And so when we're obviously talking about good therapy, we do have to talk about bad therapy. And how do we know if we're being harmed by our therapist? There are some clear indicators that you may be in bad therapy. And one of the most obvious signs that you have a bad therapist or you're not in a good treatment is that they try to have a romantic, a physical, or a sexual relationship with you under no circumstance. This is one of those things where, like, I will draw a hard line. This is a hard line. Under no circumstance should a therapist touch you or speak to you in a sexual way. Under no circumstance should a therapist have a sexual relationship with a client. That is illegal. It's unethical. It's reportable. It's not acceptable. And of course, there's bad players out there. There's bad therapists who try to groom their clients to try to have a sexual relationship with them. It can feel so painful if that happens. It can be so gradual that we don't even know that a boundary is being crossed until we feel so invested. And it breaks my heart when I hear these stories. And so I just want to be so clear that you should not be engaging in any type of sexual relationship with your therapist. That is bad therapy. That is not ever acceptable. Okay. So there's also, something to be said about therapists who talk too much about themselves. It's a form of boundary violation, but it's a lot subtler, and maybe sometimes it feels hard to know how to navigate that. But when a therapist tells you too much about their life, or reveal inappropriate personal information, it's hard because you want to please them, you like them, you don't know how to say no, and so you go along with it. But therapy is meant to be a place for you, not for your therapist to be disclosing things about themselves, especially if it's not useful to you. And so this is, a little bit of a grayer line of like how much disclosure is too much or too little. But if you're finding that your therapist is disclosing too much about themselves to you, say something. See what happens if they say, if you say to them, hey, I don't like, I feel uncomfortable when you share so much about yourself, and see what happens. It's a hard conversation. But again, that's the point of therapy, is to try to have these types of hard conversations. And if they are receptive, wonderful, you can work with that. But if they try to say, no, I don't, or what are you talking about, or this is how I do therapy and I'm not willing to change, and it doesn't work for you, then you get to decide if you want to continue to work with that therapist or not. I had a conversation with someone on Instagram, and they said that a good analogy to a good therapist is a good school teacher. They're personable, they're friendly, they're open, they are receptive to you as a student, but you don't really know much about them, right? It's like a clear function. They're serving a function. It's weird when you see them at the grocery store. You may or may not know that they're married, but they're not using teaching time to talk about their own trauma, their own drama, their own stuff, right? They're using teaching time to teach the students. That's a little bit of what a good therapist relationship should be like. If a therapist discloses something in an effort to try to relate to you and that feels uncomfortable, see if you can bring it up. But if they're using a lot of session time to talk about themselves a lot, that's an indication that they probably are not getting the type of supervision and support that they need to do this work. That may not be someone that you want to continue to work with. Okay, other signs of problematic therapists are poor boundaries, like if they consistently cut sessions short, or if they go chronically longer than session time, right? If they charge you more or less than your agreed upon a fee, if they cancel therapy on short notice consistently. Of course, once in a while it happens. Emergencies happen, but if they're consistently canceling, if they're unreliable, consistently canceling, if they come to work intoxicated, right? If they encourage you to give them gifts, If they ask to meet you outside of the therapy office, like if they ask to meet you at their home or at a restaurant or somewhere that doesn't allow for privacy, these are all indicators that there's some boundary violations that are happening. This is serious work. Being a therapist is something that has to be done with a lot of reverence and dignity for our clients. We want to be consistent and reliable to our clients. And so if we're constantly ending things late or running over, we're really disrespecting our clients' time. And so if your therapist is doing this consistently, again, bring it up to them, and if they don't show that there's any reflection or any changes, that may not be a good therapist fit for you. Another boundary violation is that they try to have a relationship with you outside of therapy. Therapists and clients are meant to have a really clear professional relationship. So a bad therapist may try to have an additional relationship with you outside of therapy. Like they want to start a business with you. They want to hire you to perform a service. They want to develop a friendship with you. They want to text you things. This is all just inappropriate dual relationshiping. It's reportable. It's not ethical. It's illegal. And we want to be really weary of this. And like I said before, right, when a therapist can offer a really clear boundary, we start and end our sessions on time. We meet in the same place every week or with the same kind of environment every week. There's an agreed upon kind of understanding of our work. It creates then the necessary foundation for the client to be more of themselves, right? Strong boundaries allow for more space for the client to explore themselves. And so if you're feeling like your therapist's boundary is confusing, if they're emailing you things that feel impinging, these are all indicators that something's not working. And so you can, if the relationship is meaningful for you, try to talk about it with them. And again, like I've been repeating myself a million times, if you bring their concerns up and they're not receptive, that's an indication that it's not going to probably be the good therapist relationship that you need it to be. Obviously, discrimination is a problem. If they make derogatory statements towards you, if they belittle you, devalue you, if they exhibit a lot of judgmental behaviors, I can't believe you did that. Why would you say that? You should not be saying that. You should not be doing that, right? Any of those types of statements are kind of indications that they don't have enough internal space to support you in your work. If they're not paying attention to you, if they're constantly getting phone calls during your session, if they're texting, I mean, these are obvious, right? Like these are, if they're not paying attention to you, that's a problem. And then this is like a trickier one, but I do think that every therapist I've met that I deeply respect, that I admire, that I think are doing really good work with their clients, they are in their own therapy and they're getting consistent supervision. Any therapist that thinks that they are beyond therapy is a red flag to me. Any therapist who is not consistently getting support, they're not getting eyes on their cases to help them think about their cases. We all have blind spots. If they're not getting consistently held in their work, I see that as like a problem. I do. Because they're not open to feedback. They're not open to the humility that's required for this work. They're not taking their own work seriously. And there's this adage, right? There's this statement in the coaching industry that like, you can only take your clients as far as you've gone yourself. And I do believe there's something to be said about that. That if we're uncomfortable with our emotional landscape, it's going to be very hard to hold space for other people. So, but if they're not in their therapy, right, that, I'm not saying that that's immediately a bad thing. It's just if they are ambivalent about their own dependency, it's going to be very hard to foster the environment where you can depend on them. So it's clear, there's some clear things that are red flags that are problem therapy, and there are some clear things that are good therapy. But the confusing part is when things feel stuck. And, it's tricky because good therapy means inherently things will feel stuck. They will feel frustrating, sometimes for a while. And it's like, how do we hold that tension without it moving into this isn't working, or this is harmful, or this is problematic? It could be, and it could not be. And how do we discern that? It can stall out for many reasons. That's not necessarily mean that something's broken, right? It can be because there's some avoidance happening on either side. It can mean that there's this like over-identification happening. It can mean that there's a real fear of disrupting the relationship. If we feel like our relationships are so fragile that we're always at the risk of somebody leaving us, we are going to, of course, feel that with our therapist. We may be terribly afraid to be honest with our therapist because maybe our therapist will fire us, or maybe they will dismiss us. Maybe they will say, I can't work with you anymore. And that can be so upsetting to us that our fear of then being honest gets in the way of something meaningful taking place. So signs, right, that something is feeling stuck is that we're repeating the same material over and over and nothing is changing, or the sessions start to feel really predictable, or nothing new is really emerging from our minds. And so this is not maybe a sign that the therapy is bad. It could be that there's something that's getting worked through, that we have to sometimes repeat things over and over and over again in order for something new to emerge. And talking about our stuckness with our therapist and talking about the feelings that come through in the stuckness is a way that we start to expand to that new territory. It could also be a sign that you could benefit from meeting with your therapist more often. Sometimes the metaphor of working with a personal trainer can be applicable to therapy, in that if you go to the gym once a week, there's tremendous benefits to that. It's certainly better than no gym at all, and the personal trainer will really help you make the most of the gym, right? However, um, twice a week may be more intense, right? You may feel sore more, but it will then obviously help you increase your strength and flexibility faster. And so if something is feeling stuck in your therapy, it may be helpful to increase contact. The more contact we have to our emotional landscape, the more something new may emerge, because a week is a long time to go by while we're feeling very stuck. And so, of course, bring it up with your therapist. So instead of turning therapy into something that you evaluate from the outside, it can be more useful to turn attention inward and notice what your experience is doing over time. So you may start with questions like, um, there's something about asking whether the work feels challenging in a way that actually matters, not just intellectually interesting or emotionally intense, but whether it touches something real in you, something that slightly disorganizes your usual way of understanding yourself. And if it doesn't necessarily mean there's a problem, but it's worth noticing what kind of safety has been established in a room that might be limiting more depth. Um, this opens up a whole conversation around safety and how is our sense of safety in the way of the growth that we're seeking. We want to be in safe relationships, and the relationships that grow us are usually relationships that have a bit of risk. But that can, I know, so quickly deteriorate into feeling dangerous or feeling harmed. And that's like another topic for another day. But we want to be very weary of being too committed to our safety at the expense of our growth. And that could be happening in therapy, and it's something to talk about. Another kind of angle to notice is to notice movement over time, not dramatic breakthroughs, but subtle shifts. How do you relate yourself between sessions? How quickly do you recover from emotional activation? Whether you find yourself responding differently in relationships outside of therapy without even trying, right? Sometimes the most important changes are almost invisible while they're happening and only become clear in hindsight. Um, and so we can feel like the therapy is stuck, but meanwhile, something actually is changing around us. Um, and it can be also useful to track what doesn't get said, right? What gets close to the surface in session and then redirected? What thoughts or feelings arise in the session that then aren't being expressed? Because what's being avoided in our therapy sessions isn't random. It's often clusters around feelings that are risky to the relationship itself, right? And whether that's anger, whether that's disappointment, whether that's dependency, whether that's longing. Notice what thoughts you have in therapy that then you don't say. That could be a really useful place to try to understand what may be getting stuck in your therapy. Um, and then, of course, there's a more fundamental question underneath all this, which is like, what actually feels at stake in being here with this therapist? What would it mean if this relationship shifted? What would it mean to be misunderstood, to be disappointed in your therapist, or to express something that might disrupt the connection? Um, these kinds of questions help move attention away from, is therapy working, as an external evaluation of behavioral changes, and more towards something more maybe alive, like what is happening in you as you are in relationship. So to close here, good therapy isn't always something you can evaluate in a single session or even in a few months. It unfolds over time, often includes discomfort, confusion, and uncertainty. And good therapy doesn't just help you feel better, it helps you become more able to face yourself. And that's where real change can take place. If it's not feeling like this is taking place for you, the invitation, my final invitation, is to talk about it with your therapist. And if you want more conversations about therapy, I recorded a whole series called Talk Therapy: How to Get the Help You Need. This was recorded, I think, while I was in grad school or just after grad school. And I try to give the lay of the land, the different modalities, the different types of treatments, how you can think about therapy, how you can find the right therapist for you. I'll put the link in the show notes for you to check out the whole series. It's a great place to go if you're looking for more resources on how to navigate the field of psychotherapy. Thank you so much for being here. Good luck in your search for good therapy. I hope you get the meaningful therapy that you deserve, and I will catch you next time.